Alexei. I have my booktube hat, and today I'm bringing you a monthly recommendations video. Monthly recommendations, in case you don't know, is a Goodreads group for booktubers and bloggers to share recommendations on a given theme every month. It is created and moderated by Trina from Between Chapters and Kayla Rain. I'll link all the information for the group below. And I've given a lot of thought to this month's video. This month's theme for April is survival stories. And there are two books that immediately came to my mind for this theme when it was announced. And they both have survival story elements, but the more I thought about these two books, the more I thought that I want to discuss them in a way that wasn't 100% framed by the notion that they're survival stories. So what I kind of want to do with this video is more of a double review video of two books that happen to have survival story elements. These are both books that I've read several times, but I haven't talked about either of them in great detail on this channel before, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about both of these books. The first one is Rite of Passage by Alexei Panshin, and the second one is going to be Deerskin by McKinley. Rite of Passage was the first book that I finished reading this month, and that was a reread for me. I read this book when I was considerably younger. I might have been in my early teens, maybe like in middle school-ish. I might have even read it twice. So I've mentioned that I was reading this before, but I haven't wrapped it up yet. This is a sci-fi coming-of-age story written in the 60s. It did win the Nebula Award, if that's something you care about. And I'm calling it a coming-of-age story as opposed to saying it's adult or YA. I do think it has the potential to appeal to both adult and young adult sci-fi readers today. It's not particularly dense reading. It's not particularly flashy or exciting reading either, if that makes any sense. It is more of a thoughtful coming-of-age story. But it definitely has a very obvious survival story premise. This takes place after Earth has been destroyed by overpopulation and war, and humanity has escaped Earth on several giant spaceships and then used those spaceships to populate colony planets. And what's left is this really interesting society where the people on the colony planets are farmers or are providing natural resources, and the people on the ships have all of the information and technology, and they are able to withhold information for trade with the relatively uneducated people of the colony worlds. But in order for this to be sustainable, the people on the ships have to practice several forms of eugenics and population control. And one of the things that they do is they have a rite of passage for children when they turn 14. They are dropped on a colony planet to survive outside the ship for 30 days, and if they survive, they are picked up, and then when they come back, they are considered legal adults. This is called the trial. They're trained for the trial. They take survival classes where they learn basic camping skills and that sort of thing. This book follows a girl named Mia Havero. It's told in the first person, and it follows her in maybe the year and a half leading up to her trial, and then the trial itself. So because that is what this is about, this is totally a survival story. But what I think is fascinating about this book is how much more it actually focuses on how the idea of the trial, her preparation for her trial, and the trial itself all challenge her ideologically, and how that experience changes the sort of adult that she'll become in this society. It really struck me reading this book this time, having recently read some newer YA sci-fi type stories, that a YA book written in this sort of sci-fi society today would probably follow a protagonist from the downtrodden colony planets who would infiltrate the ships with bold, brave ideals. But this is kind of the opposite of that, because our protagonist is a girl who is really in a position of privilege in the society. Not only is she from the ships, but she's an academic high achiever, and her father is the chairman of her ship, and so she's really in a position to wield a lot of power as an adult, although I don't think I got that so much out of the story when I read this when I was younger. I was more just focused on the events in her life. But reading it as an adult, I was more readily keying into what Mia's place is in this society. And the main trajectory of this story has more than anything to do with her changing and developing beliefs. She's a protagonist who holds a lot of prejudices that, as a reader, you're supposed to see that they're wrong. But I think that Panshin does a really good job of making sure that she is still a likable protagonist and you can root for her personal growth, despite the fact that she voices some really distasteful beliefs. And I think back to the idea of this as a survival story. I think it's also a survival story on a bigger level, a sort of level of what might humanity do given these circumstances for civilization to survive at all. What sort of sacrifices should be made, what sort of sacrifices shouldn't be made. I think these are themes I see in it more as an older reader than I did when I was a younger reader. But I think this is still a totally great book for teenagers to read. I would recommend this for teenage readers looking to dip into some older sci-fi. I think this would be a really good place to start. It's got a little adventure, a little romance, and a lot of good old-fashioned growing up. And the second book I have here is Deerskin by McKinley, which is an altogether different type of book and an altogether different type of survival story, and probably one of my favorite books of all time. This is one that I read when I was in 9th grade, and I was, I think, too young for it at the time. I wasn't really prepared for the subject matter or the denser writing style. But maybe because I read it when I wasn't quite prepared for it, it kind of hit me in a really profound way and sort of stuck to my soul in a way that made me feel compelled to find a copy and read it again when I was in college. I've now read this book 3 times, and it's one of those books that I kind of love more every time I read it. This is a retelling of the lesser-known Perrault fairy tale Donkeyskin, which is lesser known because it's a little disturbing. I will link you somewhere where you can read the full text of the original story down below, in case you're interested. That's something that I definitely do a lot when I'm considering reading a retelling of a story that I'm not familiar with. I will read the original. So maybe that's something you do too, you don't have to. But the original story is tricky. It's about a princess, and the queen is exceptionally beautiful, and when she dies, she tells the king on her deathbed that she wants him to promise to never remarry unless he can find a bride who is as beautiful as she was, and she thinks this is going to be impossible. So the really yucky part is that the king realizes as their daughter grows up that she is as beautiful as her mother, and he tries to marry her. So the first half of the fairy tale involves the princess enlisting the aid of her fairy godmother to trick the king to get herself out of this incestuous marriage. Eventually, she flees to another kingdom. In kingdom number 2, she's working as a servant, and the second half of the story becomes this sort of pseudo-Cinderella thing. So that's just the bare bones of the Donkeyskin fairy tale. But those are the bare bones that Robin McKinley is working with in here, and those elements are all in this book. But basically, this book is about the princess Leslie Lazar and her faithful dog, Ash. Robin McKinley totally loves animals, especially dogs, and this is, of all of her books, the one that is most full of dogs. So in order to really talk about this as a survival story, I feel like I have to explain some plot points that could be construed as spoilers, simply because the lead up to main events in this book is something that Robin McKinley takes her time with. So these things don't necessarily happen until a ways into the book, but I still think these are things that you might want to be aware of before deciding to read a book like this. And also it's a retelling, so nothing's gonna be that spoilery. But as a survival story, this is about a young woman surviving a violent, incestuous rape. So, like, major trigger warnings. And again, I'm sorry if you consider that a spoiler, but I feel like that's why this is a survival story, because this is about a survivor of sexual abuse. There is a portion that is a literal survival story in the mountains in winter trying to survive, but the main arc of the story is really about emotional survival and her journey to reclaiming herself and her past and being able to re-enter human civilization and to learn to trust people again. This is a very slow-paced book. It has a sort of eloquent fairy tale type writing that is a little bit stylized, but nevertheless, I found this book to be incredibly emotionally impactful, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. So those are my two books that I wanted to talk about for this monthly recommendations. I'm kind of liking taking the opportunity with these monthly recommendations videos to just sit down and chat for a longer time about fewer books, but maybe books that I haven't talked about on the channel before that I nevertheless have a lot of feelings about. But I'd love to know whether or not it's working for you. Would you like to see more books with shorter segments for each one, or is this a format that you're also enjoying? Also, if you've read either of these books, I'd love to know what you thought about them. I would love recommendations if you can think of any books that are similar to them, whether or not they're survival stories. I would love recommendations of survival stories that have sort of deeper, subtler themes. Basically, books. Talk to me about books in the comments if you'd like to. Anyways, that's all for today. See you later. Bye for now.